The metallic hum of the old singer was the only sound in the suffocating stillness of the tiny back room. Elena's eyes burned under the weak yellow light, watching the needle dance a frantic, desperate rhythm across cheap fabric. Each stitch was an act of defiance against the eviction notice tacked to the peeling wall, its red letters a 7-day countdown to homelessness. A sharp pain twisted in her stomach, the familiar gnaw of hunger she endured so her son, Leo, could eat the last of the bread and beans. The air, thick with the smell of dust and the faint, torturous aroma of food from other apartments, made nausea rise in her throat. She felt the damp chill of the concrete floor creep into her bones, a coldness that mirrored the icy dread in her chest. Her reflection in the dark window showed a woman of 32 who looked ancient, her youth devoured by worry. Outside, the city of Knoxville hummed with a life she couldn't touch, its distant sounds a cruel reminder of her complete and utter isolation. She felt her heart tighten, a physical clench of fear for the small, sleeping boy in the corner. The machine fell silent, and the ensuing quiet was a heavy blanket. Eleanor's hands, shaking with exhaustion, reached for her worn wallet. The faux leather was cracked, the seams frayed just like her hope. She carefully unfolded the few bills inside, her calloused fingers smoothing the creases on the table. A 20, another, a 10, a 5, and a small pile of coins. She counted it for the 10th time that day. A desperate ritual. $47. The number was a death sentence. It was a laughably small shield against 2 months of overdue rent, and a landlord whose patience had finally violently snapped. His voice from the day before, cold and devoid of pity, echoed in her mind. Out. By next week. No excuses. A familiar bitterness rose in her. The taste of being utterly alone. Her family, with their big house and Sunday dinners, had cast her out at 17, her pregnant belly an unforgivable sin. They had simply erased her. There was no one to call, no door to knock on. The weight of this absolute solitude pressed down on her chest, making each breath a conscious, painful effort. She was an island, and the ocean of poverty was about to swallow her whole. Her gaze drifted to the small mattress in the corner. Leo, her 7-year-old son, was a small shape under a thin, patched quilt, his chest rising and falling in the innocent rhythm of sleep. In the dim light, she could see his dark hair, damp with sweat from the room's humid heat, and the relaxed line of his jaw. He looked so safe, so utterly unaware of the wolves circling their flimsy door. A wave of love, so fierce and sharp it felt like a blade in her heart, swept through Eleanor. It was followed instantly by a crushing tide of guilt. This boy, this perfect bright boy, deserved a sunlit bedroom, not this damp, musty box. He deserved scraped knees from playing in a park, not from the cracked pavement of the back alley. He deserved a mother who could promise him breakfast, not one who secretly ate only every other day. Hot, silent tears finally escaped, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She choked back a sob. The sound trapped in her throat. He was the one pure good thing in her life, the single flame in her suffocating darkness. The thought of failing him was a terror worse than any landlord. Wiping her tears with the back of a gritty hand, Elena forced her gaze back to the machine. Beside it, a mountain of cheap fabric waited, blouses for a downtown boutique that paid her pennies per piece. It was a bitter irony, spending her life crafting clothes she could never afford, her fingers growing numb, stitching together a life for strangers. Her own body was a testament to the struggle. A permanent, searing pain lived between her shoulder blades. Her neck was a solid knot of tension, and her fingertips were perpetually sore. The constant whir of the machine wasn't a sound of productivity. It was the sound of her life being eaten away, stitch by miserable stitch. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. She worked until her vision blurred, earned just enough to stave off starvation for one more day, only to wake to the same crushing debt, the same gnawing fear. Every dollar was a ghost, already promised to the landlord, to the grocer, to a future that never arrived. Hope wasn't just gone. It was a foreign word, a concept she no longer understood. The exhaustion was more than physical. It was in her soul, a leaden weight pulling her down into the dark. She couldn't bring herself to press the foot pedal again. The silence was absolute. Rising stiffly, her joints cracking in protest, she crossed the tiny room to the single grimy window. She stared out at the glistening wet asphalt of the alley below, at the blank brick wall of the building opposite. Far above, the night sky was a dirty orange, tainted by the city's perpetual glow. Thousands of people were out there, living, loving, arguing, sleeping in warm, safe beds, entirely oblivious to the woman and child about to vanish from existence in this forgotten corner of the world. She felt a staggering sense of invisibility, as if she and Leo were ghosts already. The $47 on the table was no longer money. It was a gravestone marking the death of her efforts. There were no more miracles, no more 11th-hour saves. This was the bottom. She pressed her forehead against the cool, damp glass, the chill a welcome shock. A single thought crystallized in the quiet despair of her mind, clear and cold as the window pane. We are not going to make it. The fight was gone, burned away, leaving only a terrifying, hollow peace. The jarring ring of a telephone sliced through the oppressive quiet. It was the landlord's phone in the main house, a sound she hadn't heard directed at her in years. A few minutes later, he was at her door, his face a mask of annoyance as he held out the receiver. "For you," he grunted, the words dripping with suspicion. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Who would be calling her? Taking the phone, she felt its plastic casing, cold and foreign in her hand. "Hello," she whispered, her voice hoarse. A man's voice, crisp and professional, answered. "Am I speaking with Elena? My name is Mr. Abernathy. I'm an attorney." A lawyer. A cold dread, sharper than hunger, washed over her. It had to be about the rent. A legal escalation. She braced herself for the final blow. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the phone, the world shrinking to the disembodied voice on the line, a herald of a fate she was sure was sealed. The air grew thick, each second stretching into an eternity of waiting. "I'm calling regarding the estate of your father," the lawyer continued, his tone unwavering. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Her father, the man who was a ghost in her life, a name whispered with shame by her family, the man she hadn't seen since she was a teenager, with a burgeoning belly and defiant eyes. He passed away 2 weeks ago." The words landed without emotion. A simple fact about a stranger. There was no grief, only a numb confusion. "I'm sorry for your loss," the lawyer said, a platitude that felt hollow and absurd. He amended his will shortly before his passing. While the bulk of his estate went elsewhere, he specifically left one asset to you. Elena's mind raced. Money. It couldn't be. He wouldn't. The man who called her his greatest shame would not leave her a dime. The silence on the line crackled with unspoken history, with years of bitterness and neglect. She felt a strange, dizzying sensation, as if the damp floor of her room were tilting beneath her feet. This couldn't be real. "It's not a monetary inheritance," Mr. Abernathy clarified, as if reading her thoughts. "He left you the deed to a property, a small cabin on a plot of land in rural East Tennessee, free and clear of any lien." A deed, a cabin. The words hung in the air, abstract and unbelievable. A roof, a place that was hers. The eviction notice on the wall seemed to mock her. The cold dread in her stomach was suddenly replaced by a wild, disorienting flutter. It was a lifeline, thrown into the abyss just as she was about to let go. "The paperwork is here at my office. You are the sole owner." After giving her the address to a Crossroads general store where the keys would be waiting, the lawyer bid her a polite goodbye, and the line went dead. Elena stood frozen, the dial tone buzzing in her ear like a swarm of impossible thoughts. A home, a place to escape the judgment, the city, the shame. A sign. It had to be a sign. Maybe, just maybe, her father hadn't completely thrown her away after all. It was a fragile, terrifying thought. She hung up the phone, her hand trembling so violently she could barely place the receiver back in its cradle. She stumbled back into her room, the landlord's curious stare boring into her back, and closed the door. The small, suffocating space suddenly felt different. A crack of light had appeared in her sealed-off world. A home. Not just a room, but a home. With land. She looked at Leo, still sleeping. His small form a testament to everything she fought for. They wouldn't be on the street. They wouldn't be begging at a shelter's door. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in her chest, a sound that was half sob, half pure relief. It was a miracle, the kind of thing you read about in stories, not the kind that happens to women like her. Women who counted pennies and skipped meals and lived with the constant, grinding weight of failure. Her body felt light, the chronic pain in her shoulders momentarily forgotten. The future, which an hour ago was a black wall, now held a tiny, shimmering pinprick of light. The thought was more powerful than the promise of shelter. Maybe her father hadn't hated her. Maybe, in the end, faced with his own mortality, he had felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of remorse. This cabin wasn't a palace, she knew that, but it was more than wood and nails. It was a gesture. It was a posthumous whisper that said, "I see you, I'm sorry." This idea was a balm on a wound so old she had forgotten it was there. The bitterness she had carried for 15 years, a heavy cloak she wore every single day, began to feel a little lighter. She imagined a life away from the smog and the noise and the accusing eyes, a life where Leo could run through trees, where the air was clean, where she wasn't just the girl who got pregnant and was thrown away. She was a landowner. The word felt powerful and strange on her tongue. It was a new identity, a chance to shed the skin of her past and become someone else, someone whole, a mother who could provide a real home for her son. The decision was immediate, a leap of faith taken from the edge of a cliff. She pulled out the worn wallet. The $47, once a symbol of her doom, now looked like a key. It was just enough for 2 one-way bus tickets to the edge of the mountains. There was no room for doubt, no time for second-guessing. To stay was a certainty of ruin. To go was a chance, however slim. She began to pack, a frantic energy seizing her. Their worldly possessions were pathetically few. A handful of clothes, Leo's one stuffed bear, her sewing scissors, she couldn't leave those behind, and the few pots and pans she owned. She packed them into a single battered suitcase and a flimsy cardboard box sealed with tape. Each item she packed felt like a prayer. She wasn't just packing clothes, she was packing away the misery of this room, the scent of defeat, the memory of hunger. She was packing a new life, a life where her son would be safe. That single, burning hope eclipsed all fear. The bus station was a vortex of noise and exhaust fumes, a stark contrast to the silence she was leaving behind. Handing over nearly all her money for the 2 slips of paper felt like severing the last tie to her old life. The finality of the act sent a jolt of pure terror through her, but she pushed it down. She held Leo's small hand, his grip a firm anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "Where are we going, Mama?" he asked, his voice small, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and excitement. "We're going home, sweet boy," she said, the words feeling true for the first time. A new home, in the country with lots of trees. She tried to paint a picture for him, a picture she was desperately trying to believe in herself. A little house, a yard to play in, a quiet life. As she spoke, the lie began to feel like a promise, a future she could almost touch. The hope was fragile, a tiny flame she had to cup her hands around to protect from the wind. It was all they had. The bus groaned its way out of Knoxville, the grimy city landscape slowly surrendering to green. Eleanor stared out the window, watching the endless parade of strip malls and car dealerships dissolve into rolling hills and dense forests. The air inside the bus was stale, smelling of vinyl and disinfectant, but with each mile they traveled, she felt she could breathe a little deeper. The oppressive weight of the city, of her failure, seemed to lessen. She felt the curious glances of other passengers, noting her worn clothes, her anxious face, the cardboard box tucked by her feet. The familiar sting of shame pricked at her, but she held her head a little higher. She wasn't a vagrant. She was a woman on her way to claim her inheritance. The thought gave her a sliver of dignity. She watched the setting sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple over the distant Appalachian peaks. Her sight of such profound beauty, it brought tears to her eyes. It felt like a welcome, a good omen. Hours bled into one another. Leo fell asleep, his head resting heavily in her lap. Eleanor stayed awake, her mind a whirlwind of anxiety and anticipation. The bus engine was a monotonous drone, a soundtrack to her journey into the unknown. They were leaving everything behind, which, she thought with a bitter pang, was almost nothing. No friends, no family, just a landlord who was glad to see her go, and a boss who would replace her by morning. She traced the lines on her son's sleeping face, his perfect, innocent features, a stark contrast to the turmoil in her heart. She was doing this for him. Every risk, every fear. It was all to give him a life better than the one she'd had, a life free from the suffocating grip of poverty and shame. as the bus began to climb higher into the mountains, navigating sharp turns on dark, narrow roads. The temperature outside dropped. The air that seeped through the window sills was crisp and cool, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was the smell of a new beginning. The bus shuddered to a halt at a desolate crossroads, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. "This is it," the driver called out, his voice rough with fatigue. Elena gently woke Leo, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm. They were the only ones getting off. The doors hissed open, and they stepped out into a world of immense gas, overwhelming silence. The bus roared away, its red taillights shrinking into the darkness, leaving them utterly alone. Before them was a rusty, bullet-pocked sign for a general store that looked like it had been closed for decades, and next to it, a dirt track that vanished into a black wall of trees. The air was cool and heavy with moisture, carrying the scent of wet leaves and soil. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. Elena felt a primal knot of fear tighten in her stomach. The isolation was more profound than she could have ever imagined. She found the keys exactly where the lawyer said they'd be at, tucked inside a small magnetic box under the store's boarded-up porch. Clutching them, she took Leo's hand and started down the dirt track. The path was more of a suggestion than a road, deeply rutted and overgrown with thick weeds that snagged at her clothes. The cardboard box was awkward and heavy, and the suitcase's broken wheel made it a nightmare to drag over the uneven ground. They walked for what felt like an eternity, plunging deeper into the dense, dark woods. The canopy of leaves overhead was so thick it blocked out the rising sun, casting the path in a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of decay. A profound sense of being watched crept over Eleanor, the forest's silence feeling less like peace and more like a predator holding its breath. Leo stayed close, his small hand clutching hers tightly, his earlier excitement completely extinguished by the menacing atmosphere. And then, through a break in the trees, she saw it. The cabin. Eleanor's steps faltered, the suitcase slipping from her grasp. The fragile hope she had nurtured for the entire journey shattered like glass. It wasn't a cabin. It was a corpse of a building. The structure leaned at a drunken angle, as if one strong gust of wind would bring the whole thing down. The wood of the walls was a diseased-looking grey, furry with green moss and black with rot. The roof, which she had imagined as a sturdy shield, was a jagged mess of missing shingles and gaping holes that stared up at the sky like vacant eyes. The porch had collapsed on one side, and the front door hung grimly from a single rusted hinge, a dark, gaping mouth. This wasn't a home. This wasn't a miracle. It was a ruin. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the trees seeming to spin around her. Her tired legs felt weak, threatening to buckle. The silence of the forest was now filled with the sound of her own roaring disappointment. A foul odor drifted out from the cabin's dark doorway, a sickening miasma of rot, animal musk, and years of stagnant, damp air. It was the smell of absolute abandonment. Elena felt nausea rise in her throat, a bitter, acidic taste. She had to physically force her feet to move forward, to approach the derelict structure. Leo, sensing her horror, buried his face in her side, his small body trembling. "Mama, it smells bad," he whispered, his voice muffled by her coat. "I don't like it here." Each word was a tiny dagger in Elena's heart. She had promised him a home, a safe place. She had dragged him here, to this forgotten, decaying husk in the middle of nowhere, on the back of a fantasy. The humiliation was crushing, far worse than anything she had felt in the city. This was a new, deeper level of failure. This place wasn't a testament to her father's remorse. It was a monument to his cruelty. He hadn't left her a home. He had left her a grave. The woods pressed in, silent and suffocating. With a deep, shuddering breath, she pushed the groaning door open and stepped inside. It was even worse than the outside had promised. The floor was nothing but packed earth, littered with a thick carpet of damp, decomposing leaves, animal droppings, and pieces of the ceiling that had fallen in. Water had dripped through the countless holes in the roof for so long that dark, slimy puddles had formed in the corners, breeding grounds for insects. There was no electricity, no running water, not even a window with intact glass. In the dim light filtering through the holes above, She saw something scurry across the floor, a large, sleek rat, and Leo let out a small, terrified cry. Elena's own scream was trapped in her throat, a knot of pure, unadulterated despair. The back room in Knoxville, with its peeling paint and concrete floor, suddenly seemed like a palace. At least it had 4 solid walls and a roof that didn't leak. At least it wasn't actively rotting around them. The last ounce of strength drained from Elena's body. The cardboard box, containing all their worldly possessions, slipped from her numb fingers and landed with a soft thud on the dirt floor. She sank to her knees, the damp earth seeping through the thin fabric of her pants. A profound, crushing despair, heavier than any physical exhaustion, settled over her. It was a physical force, pressing down on her chest and squeezing the air from her lungs. This wasn't a new beginning, it was the end. Her father's final act wasn't forgiveness. It was the ultimate act of abandonment, a cruel and twisted joke played from beyond the grave. He had known what this place was. He had sent her here not to save her, but to break her completely, to banish her to a place where she and her son would simply disappear, consumed by the rot and the wilderness. The tiny flame of hope she had guarded so carefully was extinguished, leaving her in a darkness more absolute and terrifying than any she had ever known. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. For a long moment, Elena remained on her knees, the damp earth of the cabin floor stealing what little warmth she had left. The air was a physical weight, thick with the stench of decay and failure. Each ragged breath she drew in felt like swallowing poison. Her vision blurred, the dim, grimy interior of the ruin swirling into a vortex of despair. This was it, the final stop. Her father had not only cast her out, he had engineered her demise, sending her to this forgotten tomb to be swallowed by the wilderness. The silence of the forest outside was no longer peaceful. It was judgmental, a vast, quiet witness to her absolute and final defeat. A terrifying numbness began to creep through her limbs, a surrender of the soul. Her body felt impossibly heavy, pinned to the ground by the gravity of her own hopelessness. She felt nothing, a hollowed-out shell of a woman whose fight had finally, utterly, been extinguished by a dead man's hate. A small, choked sob from the doorway shattered the suffocating stillness. It was Leo. He stood silhouetted against the grey light, his small shoulders shaking, his face streaked with dirt and tears. "Mama, I'm scared," he whimpered, his voice a tiny, fragile sound in the vast, uncaring silence. The sound pierced through Elena's stupor like a shard of glass. It was a jolt of electricity to her frozen heart. Her own despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had dragged him here. She had promised him a home and brought him to this nightmare. Her failure was her own, but his fear was her responsibility. A primal, protective instinct, stronger than any self-pity, surged through her. She couldn't fix this, not today, but she could not let him see her broken. She had to move. She had to do something, anything, to fight back against the crushing inertia of this place. She had to show him they were not just here to rot. With a grunt of effort that came from deep in her chest, Elena pushed herself to her feet. Her joints screamed in protest. Her gaze swept across the debris-strewn floor, a chaotic landscape of filth and decay. It was an impossible task, but she needed to create a single, tiny island of order. One clean spot. It was a small, almost pathetic act of defiance, but it was an act nonetheless. It was a way of telling the ghost of her father, and the universe itself, that she was not dead yet. She found a fallen branch, stripped of its smaller twigs, and decided it would be her broom. Wiping her wet cheeks with the back of her hand, she took a deep, steadying breath that smelled of mold and damp earth. "It's okay, sweet boy," she said, her voice rough but firm. "We just need to clean up a little. It's just a little messy. We can make it better." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but she said it for him and for herself. She began to sweep, the end of the branch scraping unevenly across the packed dirt. A cloud of fine, grey dust rose into the air, dancing in the slivers of light that pierced the ceiling. The dust smelled ancient, a dry, forgotten scent of old wood and stone and time itself. The work was grueling and mostly pointless. She was simply moving filth from one spot to another, but the repetitive motion was a strange comfort, a rhythm to focus on. Scrape, push, scrape, push. With each movement, she felt a tiny bit of the icy paralysis in her veins begin to thaw. She was not a victim kneeling in the dirt. She was a woman working. It was a familiar role. Her muscles ached, and sweat began to slick her forehead, mingling with the grime. She focused on a small patch near the imposing stone fireplace, the only part of the structure that seemed truly solid, a bulwark against the decay that consumed everything else. Leo, watching her, seemed to draw a sliver of courage from her actions. He wiped his own eyes and began to explore the one-room cabin, his initial terror giving way to a child's natural curiosity. He kept close to the walls, his small fingers tracing patterns in the grime, his boots making soft prints in the dusty floor. He eventually gravitated toward the fireplace, its massive grey stones cool to the touch. It was like a cave, a fortress within their ruined castle. He ran his hand over the rough, hewn surfaces, feeling the gritty texture of the old mortar between them. He was quiet for several minutes, lost in his own small world, while the sound of Elena's sweeping provided a steady, rhythmic backdrop. The cabin was still a terrifying place, but with his mother in motion, it felt less like a tomb and more like a challenge they might, face together. The air was still cold, but the chill of absolute panic had subsided. "Mama?" Leo's voice was soft, hesitant. "Mama? Look." Elena paused, leaning on her makeshift broom, her back screaming in protest. She saw him kneeling at the base of the massive fireplace, his small finger pointing at one of the large stones that formed the hearth. "What is it, sweetie? Be careful around there." She was tired, her patience worn thin as thread. She assumed he'd found a bug or a strange-colored bit of moss. "No, look," he insisted, his voice rising with excitement. "This one. It moves." He pushed at the stone, a dark, squarish block of granite set low to the ground. Elena sighed. The last thing she needed was for him to bring a part of the crumbling fireplace down on himself. She started to walk over, ready to scold him gently, to tell him to leave it alone, that everything in this place was broken and best left untouched. But something in his tone, a genuine note of discovery, made her stop. Her first instinct was to dismiss it. Of course it moves, she thought bitterly. Everything here is falling apart. But as she got closer, she knelt down beside him, the damp cold of the earth instantly seeping into her knees again. The smell of cold ash and soot was strong here. Leo pushed the stone again, and she watched closely. It wasn't the unstable wobble of decay. It was a slight, precise wiggle, a shift of less than an inch, back and forth, as if it were seated on a track. Her breath caught in her throat. She placed her own hand on the stone. It was frigid, the surface rough and unyielding. Yet when she pushed, she felt it. That small, definite slide. It wasn't loose. It was designed to move. A flicker of an emotion she hadn't felt since the lawyer's call, a sharp, electric jolt of curiosity, shot through her. This was wrong. This was deliberate. Her mind, which moments before had been a fog of despair, suddenly sharpened to a fine point. She ran her fingers along the edges of the stone. The mortar in the cracks around it wasn't the same crumbling, ancient mixture as the rest of the fireplace. It was finer, and while old, it looked different. Someone had set this stone in place after the rest was built. It was a lid, disguised as a block. A cold shiver, entirely unrelated to the cabin's chill, traced a path down her spine. Who would go to such trouble? And why? The image of her father's face, stern and distant, flashed in her mind. This cabin was his. This secret, if it was one, must have been his too. The despair she had felt began to recede, replaced by a powerful, pulsating question mark. The cruel joke of the inheritance suddenly felt more complex, more layered. Maybe it wasn't a joke at all. Driven by a new, frantic energy, Elena tried to pull the stone out with her bare hands. She dug her fingernails into the tight crack, pulling with all her might. The rough stone scraped her skin, and she felt a sharp pain as two of her nails tore. But the block wouldn't budge more than its slight wiggle. A grunt of frustration escaped her lips. It was wedged in tight, sealed by time and gravity. She needed leverage. She needed a tool. Her eyes darted around the ruined cabin, scanning the debris with a newfound purpose. Her gaze landed on a long, slender piece of metal lying in the pile of rotted wood and fallen plaster near the hearth. It was an iron fire poker, its surface a mottled patchwork of black iron and orange rust. It was heavy, solid. It was perfect. A surge of adrenaline, fueled by a dizzying mix of hope and fear, flooded her system. She scrambled over the debris and grabbed the poker. It was heavier than it looked, and the metal was shockingly cold, its pitted, rusty surface rough against her palms. It felt like a weapon, a key, an answer. She carried it back to the fireplace, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she could feel the vibration in her throat. Leo watched her, his eyes wide and silent, sensing the dramatic shift in the room's energy. This was no longer about cleaning. This was a hunt. Kneeling again, Eleanor took a deep breath, the dusty air catching in her lungs. She carefully worked the pointed tip of the iron poker into the thin crack above the stone block. The fit was snug. The metal scraped against the stone with a gritty sound that set her teeth on edge. This was the moment. Either the stone would move, or her last fragile spark of curiosity would be crushed. She gripped the long handle of the poker with both hands and pushed down. At first, nothing happened. The iron bar bowed slightly under the strain. She repositioned her hands, put her entire weight into it, her muscles screaming. A low, groaning sound echoed in the dead quiet of the cabin. It was the sound of something that had not moved in a very, very long time. Stone grated against stone. With a sudden, jarring lurch, the block gave way, sliding outward and scraping a long, ugly gash in the packed dirt of the floor. The noise was loud, shocking, and Leo let out a small yelp of surprise. Scrambling backward, Elena fell forward, her hands slipping on the poker. Catching herself just before she hit the ground, she stared, panting, at the opening she had created. Behind where the stone had been, there was a perfect rectangular hole, a void, a secret chamber, dark and silent. A wave of cool, dry air washed out from the hollow space, carrying a scent that was entirely different from the cabin's damp rot. It was the smell of a sealed tomb, of profound dryness, of old paper, and of time itself, locked away. It was the smell of things intentionally hidden. Eleanor's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Fear and exhilaration warred within her. What had her father, the man who had wanted nothing to do with her, hidden so carefully in the heart of this ruin? Was it money, a cruel pittance left to mock her, or was it something else entirely? The darkness within the compartment was absolute, seeming to swallow the dim light of the room. It was a tangible blackness, full of unspoken possibilities. She could feel the mystery of it calling to her, a siren song of secrets that promised to answer the questions that had haunted her entire life. She hesitated for only a second. Then, with a hand that trembled so badly, she had to steady it with her other. She reached into the dark, cold void. Her fingers brushed against cobwebs, thick and sticky, and she flinched, but pushed deeper. The air inside was still and cold. Then, her fingertips touched something. It wasn't the hard, rough surface of stone. It was something coarse and slightly waxy, and beneath it, something hard and unyielding. It was a package. Her fingers closed around it. It was heavy, substantial. Her mind raced with frantic possibilities. Jewels, gold bars, the deed to a different, better property. It had to be valuable. No one would go to such lengths to hide something worthless. Every fiber of her being screamed that this was the reason she had been sent here. This was the true inheritance. With a surge of strength, she pulled the object from its hiding place and into the dim light. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, and it was wrapped meticulously in several layers of thick yellowed wax cloth. The wrapping was brittle with age, cracking at the corners, but it had done its job. The box inside, while rusted, had been protected from the relentless damp that had consumed the rest of the cabin. She carried it reverently, as if it were a holy relic, and placed it on a patch of floor cleared of the worst of the debris. A single, bright beam of sunlight cut through a hole in the roof, illuminating the box like a spotlight on a stage. For a moment, she and Leo just stared at it. A strange, alien artifact from a forgotten time. A time capsule left by a man she barely knew. Her fingers, still shaking, fumbled with the ancient cloth. It flaked away under her touch, turning to a fine, yellowish dust. The smell of beeswax and old canvas filled the air. She finally pulled the last of the wrapping away, revealing the box itself. It was made of simple tin, its surface a mottled landscape of dark corrosion and bright orange rust. A simple clasp on the front was rusted shut, sealing the contents within. There was no keyhole. A fresh wave of frustration washed over her. To come so far to find this, only to be stopped by a rusted piece of metal. But then she remembered the poker. She grabbed it again, its weight familiar in her hand now. She wedged the sharp tip under the lid and pried. The metal groaned in protest, a high screeching shriek that echoed off the damp walls. With a final, loud pop, the lid gave way, bending upward. Eleanor tossed the poker aside and lifted the lid with her hands. A puff of dry, musty air, the captured breath of decades, rushed out to meet her. It smelled intensely of brittle paper and faded ink. She peered inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light within the box. Her heart, which had been soaring with wild expectation, plummeted. There was no glint of gold, no sparkle of diamonds, no neat stacks of cash. The box was filled to the brim with nothing but paper. For a crushing second, the old despair returned. It was all a trick, a box of worthless old papers, her father's final, most elaborate joke. The entire journey, the discovery, it was all just another path to the same bitter disappointment. She felt a fool for having allowed herself to hope. But as her eyes focused, she saw it wasn't just trash. The papers were organized. They were letters, hundreds of them, tied into neat bundles with string. One particular bundle, right on top, was different. It was bound with a satin ribbon. The color faded from a vibrant pink to a pale, ghostly rose. It was a feminine touch in this masculine, rustic hiding place. It seemed personal. It seemed important. A new kind of curiosity, deeper and more complex than a simple treasure hunt, took root in her. This wasn't about wealth. This was about a story. Her breath hitched. She reached into the box, her fingers brushing over the brittle edges of the topmost bundle. The ribbon felt fragile, like it might disintegrate at her touch. This felt far more intimate and terrifying than finding gold ever could. She carefully lifted the ribbon-tied bundle from the box. The paper was so old and dry it felt like a dead leaf. She untied the ribbon, its silk fibers crumbling slightly as the knot came undone. The first letter on the stack was addressed in a neat, elegant cursive. It was a woman's handwriting, but the letter beneath it, and the one beneath that, were different. She spread a few of them on the floor. The handwriting on each was unique, some a frantic scrawl, others a careful, laborious print. She picked one up at random. The ink was a faded, rusty brown. "Mr. Hayes," it began. It was her father's name. A chill went through her. These weren't his letters. They were letters to him. They were from dozens of different people, men and women. Their names signed at the bottom of pages filled with desperate pleas, angry accusations, and heartbreaking stories. Her disappointment evaporated, replaced by a sense of profound and daunting gravity. This was no joke. This was an archive, a collection of testimonies. She picked up another letter, its author begging her father for help, speaking of being forced off their land, of fraudulent documents, of threats against their family. The words leaped off the page, charged with an ancient pain. Elena's hands trembled as she held the fragile paper. She looked around the rotting cabin, then back at the box overflowing with silent voices from the past. She understood now. This place, this ruin, it wasn't a punishment. And this box, it wasn't a treasure. It was a burden. It was evidence. Her father hadn't sent her here to die. He had sent her here to find this. The true mystery wasn't what was in the box, but what story these letters told, and what she was supposed to do about it. The afternoon light, thin and watery, slanted through the gaping holes in the roof as Elena sat on the dirt floor, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. The musty scent of the letters filled the small space, a perfume of ink, dust, and buried sorrow. She read, her fingers trembling as she unfolded each brittle page. The first letter was from a woman named Sarah Gable. Her cursive was shaky. The ink bled in places as if from tears. She wrote of men arriving with papers, of a new survey that claimed her family's spring-fed creek now belonged to the coal company. She begged Mr. Hayes, Elena's father, to look at his original maps to tell the truth. "They say our deed is worthless," Sarah wrote, the desperation a living thing on the page. "This land has been ours for 100 years. Where will we go?" Elena felt a stone settle in her stomach, a cold, hard knot of dread. The letter was dated 1978. It was a plea that had clearly gone unanswered. A deep, vicarious grief washed over her, the woman's pain echoing across 40 years to land in her lap. She set Sarah's letter aside and picked up another, this one written in a strong, angry hand by a man named John Miller. His words were a torrent of fury. He called her father a coward and a tool of the devil. He described being physically forced from his home by armed men who worked for the company, while the county sheriff watched and did nothing. He attached a small, folded piece of paper, a carbon copy of a receipt for a bribe paid to a local judge. The proof was right there, fragile and yellowed, a testament to a crime that had been systematically buried. As Eleanor read more and more, the individual stories began to weave together into a single, horrifying tapestry of corruption. Family after family, homestead after homestead, all displaced by the same method: fraudulent surveys, legal intimidation, and brute force. The scope of the injustice was staggering, a quiet, ruthless war waged against the poor and the powerless. Elena felt the air in the cabin grow thick, heavy with the weight of all these stolen lives. The name appeared again and again, a dark thread connecting every story of loss and despair: Croft Mining. And with it, another name, whispered with fear and hatred in the letters: Silas Croft. He was the owner, the orchestrator, the invisible hand that had signed the eviction notices and hired the thugs. The writers described him as a man with ice in his veins, a man who saw the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be plundered, its people disposable obstacles. He was the villain in every story. Eleanor felt a cold shiver trace a path down her spine, the name settling into her mind with a sense of ominous weight. She now had a face, or at least a name, for the monster who had destroyed so many families. This wasn't just a corporate land grab, it was the work of one man's bottomless greed. She imagined him, a powerful figure moving behind the scenes, his wealth built upon the rubble of homes like this one, his legacy written in the tears of people like Sarah Gable. Then came the letter that made her whole body go cold. It was from one of Croft's former employees, a man confessing his sins on what he believed was his deathbed. He described the process in detail, how they would target isolated families and exploit their lack of legal knowledge. And then he mentioned his partner, the young surveyor, Hayes. He had a good heart but no spine, the man wrote. Croft had a hold on him. We drew maps that were pure fiction, moving property lines by half a mile, turning streams into deserts on paper. Hayes knew it was wrong. I saw it in his eyes every single day. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Her father. He wasn't just a witness, he was a participant, an unwilling one, perhaps, but a cog in the machine nonetheless. The image of her distant, cold father was suddenly replaced by that of a young, terrified man, trapped in an impossible situation. The nausea she'd felt earlier returned with a vengeance, a sour taste of shame and a strange, aching pity. A profound, heartbreaking clarity washed over her. She finally understood. The guilt had consumed him. It explained the distance, the coldness, the self-imposed exile from his own life. Each of these letters was a sin he had carried, a voice he couldn't silence. He had kept them not as trophies, but as a constant, agonizing reminder of his own moral failure. The realization struck her with the force of a revelation, recontextualizing her entire life. His rejection of her wasn't about her pregnancy. Not really. It was about his own self-loathing, a feeling so immense he couldn't bear to let anyone, especially his daughter, get close enough to see it. He had built a wall around himself made of these terrible secrets. Elena pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, a single, hot tear escaping and tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness for herself, but of a deep, complicated sorrow for the young man her father had been. And the cabin? This ruin wasn't a final, cruel joke. It was a penance. She understood now with absolute certainty. He had bought back this specific piece of stolen land, one small square in the vast quilt of his guilt. He had let it rot, preserved in its state of decay as a monument to the destruction he had helped cause. This wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum. He hadn't sent her here to break her. He had sent her here to find the truth, to pass the burden of this evidence on to her. It was his confession, his desperate, posthumous plea for some kind of absolution, a hope that his daughter might have the courage he lacked. The weight of the rusted box felt immense in the quiet room. It was the weight of justice deferred, a history of pain entrusted to her. The responsibility was terrifying. It was a legacy far heavier than any fortune of gold or silver, and it was now hers to carry alone in the suffocating silence of the woods. Suddenly, a sound tore through the forest's quiet, a noise so alien to this place that Elena flinched, her entire body tensing. It was an engine, but it wasn't the distant groan of a farm truck or the whine of a dirt bike. It was a low, powerful purr, the sound of a luxury vehicle, its engine tuned to a quiet hum of absolute confidence. It grew steadily louder, the sound echoing through the trees as it navigated the rough, overgrown track leading to the cabin. Leo, who had been quietly stacking small stones, froze and ran to her side, his eyes wide with fear. The sound was a violation, an intrusion of the modern world into this capsule of the past. Elena's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Who would be coming here? No one knew she was here except a lawyer in a city miles away. No one but the ghosts in this box. An instinct, old and primal, told her this was not a friendly visit. She scrambled to her feet, quickly gathering the letters and shoving them back into the metal box. She slid the box back into its dark hiding place inside the hearth and tried to push the heavy stone block back into place. It wouldn't sit flush, the edge of it jutting out slightly, a clear sign of disturbance. There was no time. The engine sound was close now, right outside. It stopped, and the ensuing silence was more menacing than the noise had been. A moment later, a car door closed with a solid, expensive-sounding thud. Elena's blood ran cold. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her arm protectively around Leo's shoulders, her eyes locked on the gaping, broken doorway. She could hear the soft crunch of expensive leather shoes on the damp leaves and twigs outside. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, the sound of someone who owned every inch of ground they walked on, someone who was in no hurry at all. A figure appeared in the doorway, a tall, elderly man silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. As her eyes adjusted, the details came into sharp, terrifying focus. He was in his late 80s, but he stood straight and tall, his frame lean and wiry. He wore a crisp, tailored tweed jacket and dark trousers, clothes that were ludicrously out of place in this ruin. His face was a mask of wrinkles, but his eyes, a pale, piercing blue, were sharp and intelligent. They swept the room, taking in the decay, the dirt floor, and finally settling on her and Leo with an unnerving stillness. A thin, bloodless smile touched his lips, a gesture that held no warmth, no kindness. It was the smile of a predator that has cornered its prey and knows it. The air in the cabin grew thin, electric with unspoken tension. Elena felt a wave of cold dread wash over her, a certainty that she was looking at the man from the letters. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was as out of place as his clothing. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders, a voice that had never known doubt. "You must be Elena, Hayes's girl." He stepped inside, moving with a surprising agility for his age. He glanced around the squalid interior, a look of faint, aristocratic distaste on his face. "I am Silas Croft. Your father and I did a great deal of business together many years ago." "A long time ago." He said the name without a trace of shame or hesitation. Croft. The name hit her like a physical shock. He was here. The architect of all that pain was standing 3 feet away from her, his cold blue eyes boring into hers. Her throat went dry, her tongue feeling thick and useless in her mouth. She could feel the weight of all the silent voices in the fireplace behind her, screaming. Leo pressed closer, his small hand gripping her pants leg with desperate strength. Mr. Croft ignored the boy, his focus entirely on Elena. "I heard you'd come into this property. A sentimental gesture on your father's part, I suppose, though I can't imagine why. This place was a ruin even back then." His smile widened slightly, but it still didn't reach his eyes. "He was a complicated man, your father, full of misplaced loyalties." The words were chosen carefully, each one a subtle probe, a test. He was trying to see what she knew. Elena felt a surge of adrenaline cut through her fear, sharpening her senses. She had to be careful. He was a spider, and he was testing the threads of his web. Her mind raced, a frantic scramble to appear ignorant, harmless. She stared back at him, trying to keep her face a blank mask. betraying none of the furious terror and righteous anger that was boiling inside her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken history. He was waiting for her to speak, to reveal her hand. "Look, my dear," he continued, his tone shifting to one of feigned sympathy. "This is no place for a young woman and a child. It's remote, it's falling apart, it's unhealthy. I feel a certain responsibility for your father's sake. I'd be willing to take it off your hands. A small sum, of course. The land itself isn't worth much, but enough for you to get a bus ticket back to the city and find a proper place to live. Let's say $5,000, cash." The offer was an insult. It was a pittance, a crumb from the vast table of wealth he had built on this very land. It was a test, and she knew it. He wasn't trying to buy the land, he was trying to buy her silence. He was trying to see if she was just a desperate woman who could be bought off cheaply. The number, $5,000, hung in the air. Just hours ago, that sum would have seemed like an impossible fortune, the answer to all her prayers. Now it felt like blood money. Eleanor looked at Leo's frightened face, then at the dirt and decay surrounding them. $5,000 could get them out of here. It could mean a clean apartment, food on the table, a life free from this crushing poverty and this terrifying secret. A part of her, the desperate, pragmatic mother, screamed at her to take it, to take the money and run, to forget the letters, to forget the ghosts. But then she thought of Sarah Gable's tear-stained letter, of John Miller's rage, of the dozens of families scattered to the winds. She thought of her father, living a life sentence of guilt. A fire she didn't know she possessed ignited in her chest. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm as the stone in the fireplace. "The land is not for sale." The word hung in the air, a small, solid act of rebellion. The fake smile on Silas Croft's face vanished instantly. It didn't fade. It was simply gone, replaced by a mask of cold and hard calculation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. His pale blue eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she saw the ruthless predator beneath the civilized veneer. He took a step closer, invading her space, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "That's a foolish decision, my dear," he purred, the sound like gravel scraping against silk. "A very foolish decision. This is a dangerous place, isolated. Things happen out here in the woods. Snakes, fires, hunting accidents. It would be a tragedy if something were to happen to a pretty young mother, all alone out here with her boy." He let the words hang in the air, each one a poisoned dart. He glanced meaningfully at Leo, who shrank behind Elena's legs. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare. He held her gaze for one more chilling moment, a silent promise of violence, then turned and walked out of the cabin without another word. A minute later, she heard the powerful engine start, the sound of the tires spinning in the dirt, and then the noise faded back into the forest's oppressive silence. Elena's legs finally gave out, and she sank to the floor, pulling Leo into her lap. She was shaking uncontrollably, her body flooded with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror. The box of letters in the fireplace no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a ticking bomb. She had defied Silas Croft. She had shown him that she knew, and that she couldn't be bought. And now, she and her son were his loose ends. The $5,000 seemed like a distant, foolish dream. The choice she had made had trapped her here, with a monster who knew exactly where she was. What would you have done in her place? Would you have taken the money, guaranteeing your child's safety but sacrificing justice? Or would you have refused, risking everything for a fight that wasn't yours? The silence Silas Croft left behind was a living entity, a suffocating presence that pressed in on Elena from all sides. She stayed on the floor, her arms a vice around Leo, her body racked with tremors that refused to subside. The air still tasted of his cologne and his menace. Every creak of the rotting wood, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded like the crunch of his expensive shoes returning. Fear was a physical thing, a cold liquid filling her lungs, making each breath a shallow, painful gasp. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of pure terror. She had poked the monster, and now it knew she was here. It knew she was a threat. The vast, indifferent wilderness was no longer a symbol of isolation, but a cage, and the monster had the only key. Her mind was a chaotic storm of What-ifs, each one ending in a vision of violence and loss. She felt a profound, chilling certainty that they would not see the morning. This ruin was to be their tomb, after all. Hours crawled by, each minute a lifetime. The slivers of daylight cutting through the roof slowly shifted, turning from silver to gold, then to a deep, bloody orange as the sun began to set. The encroaching darkness felt like an accomplice to Croft's threat, a heavy blanket that would soon cover his evil deeds. Elena finally forced her stiff, aching limbs to move. She couldn't just wait here like a lamb for the slaughter. She pushed the heavy stone back in front of the hollow, the grating sound of stone on dirt a protest in the quiet. It didn't sit flush, a testament to her frantic haste, a clear sign of disturbance, but it was the best she could do. She huddled with Leo in the corner furthest from the door, pulling their thin blanket around their shoulders. The temperature was plummeting, the damp cold of the earth seeping into their bones. Leo had fallen into an uneasy, whimpering sleep in her lap, his small body twitching. Eleanor stayed awake, her ears straining, listening for the sound of the engine that she knew with sickening certainty would return. A sharp rap on the doorframe made her entire body jolt. A strangled scream caught in her throat. Leo woke with a cry, clutching her tightly. It wasn't the sound of an expensive car. There had been no engine, just the sudden, shocking knock. Her mind went blank with terror. He was here. He'd come back on foot to finish it. Heavy, slow footsteps crunched on the debris just inside the doorway. It was not the confident stride of Silas Croft. This was a slower, more deliberate tread, the sound of age and weariness. A figure appeared, not a tall, menacing silhouette, but a stooped, frail shape against the last of the fading twilight. It was a man, much older than Croft, his shoulders slumped with the weight of years. He held an old kerosene lantern, its warm, yellow glow pushing back the shadows and illuminating a face as wrinkled and weathered as an old leather map. The light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the decaying walls and revealing the profound kindness in his eyes. "Easy now," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like stones shifting at the bottom of a creek. It was a voice that held the slow, patient cadence of the mountains. "Didn't mean to startle you folks. Saw the fancy car tearing out of here earlier. Figured it was Croft." He held the lantern up, its light falling on her pale, terrified face. "You must be the Hayes girl. You've got his eyes." The man smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and something clean like pine soap. He wore a patched flannel shirt and denim overalls, his hands gnarled and thick-knuckled from a lifetime of hard work. He was the antithesis of Silas Croft in every conceivable way. The oppressive fear in Elena's chest loosened its grip by a fraction, replaced by a cautious, desperate curiosity. He knew her father. He knew Croft. He was a piece of the history she had just unearthed, a living ghost from the box of letters, stepping out of the past and into her terrifying present. "My name is Hemlock," he said, setting the lantern down on a relatively stable-looking crate. The warm light created a small island of sanctuary in the vast, cold darkness of the cabin. "Abel Hemlock. My family used to own the land just over that ridge before Croft Mining decided they owned everything." He said the name with a quiet, ancient bitterness, a wound that had clearly never healed. Elena stared at him, speechless. Hemlock. She had read that name, in a letter written by a woman named Mary Hemlock, pleading with her father to verify the true property line of their farm. This was her son, or her husband, a direct link to the ink and paper she had touched. I'm Elena," she finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. "He was my father." Her own words sounded strange, acknowledging a connection she had spent her life trying to forget. But now, that connection was the only thing that mattered. Mr. Hemlock nodded slowly, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. "I remember him. A young fella, not much older than you are now, sent out here with his surveyor's tools. He had a good face, but there was a sadness in him even then, a deep-down trouble you could see in his eyes." He looked at her again, his expression softening with a pity that wasn't condescending, but deeply empathetic. Croft had his hooks in him deep, made him do things a man has to carry for the rest of his days. The old man's words were a balm and a blade. He was confirming the terrible truth she had pieced together. But he spoke of her father not with condemnation, but with a weary understanding. A sudden, overwhelming urge to confide in this stranger, this keeper of history, washed over Elena. She was so tired of being alone with this secret. The weight of it was crushing her. She needed someone else to know, to validate the story, to tell her she wasn't going mad. With a trembling hand, Elena pointed to the fireplace. "He left something," she said, her voice cracking. "He hid it. In there." Mr. Hemlock's gaze followed her finger to the hearth, to the stone that was still slightly askew. A look of slow, profound understanding dawned on his face. He didn't look surprised, but rather as if he was seeing the final piece of a puzzle he'd been staring at for 40 years finally fall into place. He gave a single, slow nod. "I always wondered," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "He bought this place back, you know. Paid a fortune for it, long after it was worthless. Let it rot. People around here thought he was crazy, but he wasn't crazy. He was penancing." The word, the same one that had formed in her own mind, struck Elena with the force of a bell tolling. This old man saw the truth with a clarity that had taken her a lifetime of pain to even glimpse. The validation was so powerful, it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "What did he leave you, girl?" Hemlock asked gently, his voice soft. Elena didn't answer with words. She got up, her joints protesting, and moved the heavy stone aside once more. She reached into the cold darkness of the compartment and pulled out the rusted metal box. She carried it back to the small circle of lantern light and set it between them. The box seemed to hum with a latent energy in the flickering glow, a Pandora's box of old sins. She lifted the lid, revealing the stacks of bundled letters within. Mr. Hemlock leaned forward, his weathered face etched with a deep, sorrowful reverence. He didn't need to read them. He had lived them. He reached a gnarled finger into the box and gently touched the top of a bundle, his touch as light as a whisper. "The voices," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He kept the voices of the lost. I never would have thought he had the courage for that." He looked at Elena, his eyes shining in the lantern light, and she understood he wasn't just talking about her father. "There's something you don't know," Mr. Hemlock said, his gaze turning serious, intense. He sat back, his eyes searching her face, as if gauging her strength. "There's a reason your father cut you off, a reason he sent you away and never looked back. It wasn't because of the boy." He gestured toward Leo, who was now awake and watching him with wide, solemn eyes. "That's the story Croft wanted everyone to believe, the story your family believed. The truth is much uglier." Elena felt her heart freeze in her chest. A wave of dizziness swept over her. Every insecurity, every feeling of shame and rejection she had ever felt about her teenage pregnancy had been built on that single, cruel foundation. To hear him say it wasn't true felt like the ground was dissolving beneath her feet. What do you mean?" she stammered, the words barely audible. The air grew still, the only sound the faint hiss of the kerosene lantern. "About a year after the worst of the land grabs," Hemlock began, his voice low and steady, "your father tried to do the right thing. He'd seen too much, carried too much guilt. He gathered up his original surveys, the true ones, and copies of some of the letters he'd already started receiving. He was going to take them to a federal prosecutor in Nashville." Elena pictured her father, young and tormented, making that brave, desperate decision. A flicker of pride, an emotion she had never associated with him, sparked in her heart. "But Silas Croft has eyes and ears everywhere. He always has. He found out what your father was planning before he could even leave the county." The old man's face darkened, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Croft didn't threaten your father directly. He was too clever for that. He was a man who knew how to find a person's breaking point and press on it until they shattered." Elena held her breath, a sense of cold, creeping horror building within her. "You had just been born," Mr. Hemlock continued, his voice barely a whisper. "A tiny little thing, not more than a few weeks old. Croft paid your father a visit. He didn't shout or make a scene. He just sat there, calm as you please, and told your father that he knew he had a beautiful, healthy baby daughter." A profound chill washed over Elena, so intense it felt like being plunged into ice water. The cabin, the letters, the entire history of this place snapped into a new, terrifying focus. It wasn't just about land or money anymore. It was about her. She had been a part of this story from the very beginning. She looked at Leo, sleeping beside her, and felt a wave of protective fury so fierce it made her physically sick. The thought of anyone threatening her child, even in words, was an unbearable violation. Her mind struggled to comprehend the evil of a man like that, a man who would use a newborn baby as a weapon. Croft told him the evidence would disappear, Hemlock said, his eyes hard as flint. And if your father ever spoke a word of it to anyone, ever tried to be a hero again, you would disappear too. He made it very clear. An accident, a crib fire, a sickness the doctors couldn't explain. He promised your father he would live the rest of his long, empty life, knowing he had traded his daughter's life for a piece of paper. The raw brutality of the threat stole the air from Elena's lungs. She felt a strangled sob rise in her throat. The cold, distant man she had resented her entire life was a fiction, a role he had been forced to play. His rejection wasn't an act of cruelty toward her, it was the ultimate act of love. He had sacrificed his relationship with her, endured her hatred, and lived in a self-imposed prison of guilt, all to keep her alive. He had walled himself off, not to keep her out, but to keep Croft's poison from ever touching her. The weight of this revelation was crushing. It was a truth so immense it shattered the very foundations of her identity. 15 years of bitterness, of feeling worthless and discarded, evaporated in an instant, replaced by a grief so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. She had hated a hero. She had cursed a man who had been silently protecting her from a monster she never knew existed. Hot tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of self-pity. They were tears for him, for the stolen years, for the love he was never able to show, for the lonely, terrified life he had been forced to lead. She finally understood the sadness Hemlock had seen in his eyes. It was the perpetual mourning for a daughter he had to pretend he didn't love. She pressed her fist to her mouth to stifle a wail of sorrow, the sound of a lifetime of misunderstanding breaking apart inside her. His coldness was a shield, Mr. Hemlock said softly, his voice full of a gentle, heartbreaking pity. He had to make you hate him. He had to make you stay away, especially from this land, from this secret. As long as you were far away, living your own life, you were safe. Bringing you into it would have been signing your death warrant. Elena looked down at the box of letters, the legacy of his guilt and his courage. He hadn't just left her a burden of proof. He had left her the story of his love, written in the ink of his own personal hell. This inheritance was not a request for her to fight his battle. It was his final, desperate attempt to tell her the truth, to explain the sacrifice he had made, to ask for a forgiveness he had never been able to request in life. He wanted her to know that he had loved her, in the only twisted, heartbreaking way he had been allowed to. A sudden guttural roar shattered the night stillness, jolting them all. It was an engine, but not the smooth purr of Croft's sedan. This was a heavy, throbbing diesel, the sound of a large truck laboring up the dirt track, its headlights cutting wild, frantic paths through the trees. Mr. Hemlock was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of grim certainty. He didn't waste any time, he hissed, kicking dirt over his lantern, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness. That's his men. They're not here to talk. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Elena. The theoretical threat had just become brutally real. The sound of the engine was the sound of her own impending death. It grew louder, a monstrous, snarling beast coming to devour them. The truck screeched to a halt right outside the cabin, its engine idling with a menacing growl that vibrated through the floorboards. "The box," Hemlock commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Get the box, Eleanor. Now." His words cut through her paralysis. She scrambled back to the hearth, her hands fumbling in the darkness. Her fingers found the cold metal. The box was heavier now, its weight the gravity of her father's life and her own. Car doors slammed, 2 of them. Heavy boots crunched on the ground outside. Muffled, rough voices cut through the night air. They were close, so close. Elena's heart felt like it was going to explode in her chest. She could hear her own blood roaring in her ears, a sound that almost drowned out the men outside. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she gagged, tasting the bitter tang of fear in the back of her throat. This was it. The final act of Croft's 40-year-old crime was about to play out, and she and her son were at its center. "There's a window in the back," Hemlock whispered urgently, grabbing her arm. "It's boarded up, but the wood is rotten. We can break through." He was already pulling her toward the rear wall of the cabin, his old man frailty gone, replaced by a desperate, wiry strength. Leo was crying now, a high, terrified sound that Elena was sure the men outside could hear. She clamped a hand over his mouth, whispering, "Shh, baby, please, be quiet." Her own voice shaking so badly the words were barely intelligible. Outside, there was a loud metallic clank, followed by the sickening glug-glug-glug of liquid being poured from a can. The sharp, chemical stench of gasoline suddenly flooded the cabin, stinging her nostrils and making her eyes water. They were going to burn it. They were going to burn them alive. The abstract horror became a concrete, suffocating reality. "Now?" Hemlock grunted, and he threw his shoulder against the boarded-up back window. The rotten wood groaned, splintered, but didn't give. Elena, clutching the box to her chest with one arm and holding Leo with the other, felt a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. She was not going to die here. She would not let her son die here. She passed the box to Hemlock. "Take him," she gasped, pushing Leo into the old man's arms. Then she turned and launched herself at the window, using her feet. She kicked once, twice, the impact jarring her entire body. On the third kick, the boards exploded outward with a loud crack, showering them with splinters and dust. A rush of cold, clean night air flooded in, a stark contrast to the gasoline-soaked atmosphere of the cabin. It was an opening, a chance, a jagged, dark rectangle of hope. Outside, a man shouted, "Hey, what was that?" The heavy footsteps started moving around the side of the cabin. There was no more time. "Go!" Eleanor screamed, shoving Mr. Hemlock toward the opening. He clambered through, holding Leo tight, his old body moving with a speed born of pure terror. He stumbled but caught his balance on the other side. Eleanor grabbed the box, its sharp metal corners digging into her ribs. Anne scrambled through the hole after them. A long splinter from the broken frame tore a deep, searing gash in her arm, but she barely felt the pain. She was out. They were out. Behind them, she heard a whoosh, a sound like a giant's exhale, as the gasoline ignited. An unearthly orange light erupted from the cabin, painting the surrounding trees in a flickering, hellish glow. The heat was instantaneous and intense, a wave of scorching air that blasted against her back. "Run!" Hemlock yelled, his voice ragged. "My place is just through these trees. Follow the light." He pointed to a single, steady pinprick of yellow light visible through a gap in the forest, a distant star in the terrifying darkness. Then he was gone, disappearing into the undergrowth with Leo. Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze drawn to the fire. Flames were already pouring out of the doorway and the holes in the roof, licking at the night sky. The ruin that had been her father's penance was being consumed, purified by the very evil it stood against. She heard the men shouting, their figures silhouetted against the roaring inferno. "They're getting away!" one of them yelled. A gunshot cracked through the night, the sound shockingly loud. A bullet whizzed past her head with a sound like a tearing hornet, close enough for her to feel the disturbance in the air. That sound broke the spell. Elena turned and plunged into the woods, running with a desperation she had never known. The forest, which had been menacing and dark, was now their only sanctuary. Thorny vines clawed at her clothes and tore at her skin, ripping long, stinging scratches across her face and arms. The gash from the window frame was bleeding freely now, a hot, sticky wetness running down to her elbow. She held the metal box like a shield, its weight both a burden and a reason to keep going. Her lungs burned, each breath a searing agony. Her only guide was the memory of that single, distant light and the sound of Hemlock and Leo crashing through the undergrowth ahead of her. The sounds from behind grew louder, the crackle of the fire, the enraged shouts of the two men, and the terrifying sound of their heavy boots crashing through the woods in pursuit. The ground was uneven, a treacherous carpet of fallen leaves and gnarled roots that seemed to grab at her ankles. She stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully, and went down hard, the impact knocking the wind from her. The metal box flew from her grasp, landing with a dull thud a few feet away. For a heart-stopping second, she lay there, gasping for air, the smell of damp earth and her own coppery blood filling her senses. The shouts of the men were closer now. She could hear their labored breathing. Panic screamed at her to leave the box, to save herself. But then she saw her father's face in her mind, his sad, protective eyes. This box was his final words to her. It was the proof of his love, the weapon of his justice. She would not leave it behind. With a raw cry of effort, she pushed herself up, grabbed the box, and forced her screaming legs to run again. The forest was a disorienting maze of black trunks and clutching branches. The flickering light from the burning cabin cast monstrous, dancing shadows that seemed to leap out at her. Every shadow looked like a man. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep right behind her. Her heart was a wild thing, trying to beat its way out of her chest. She could feel the men gaining on her, their presence a palpable wave of malice at her back. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw the beams of 2 flashlights cutting through the darkness, sweeping back and forth, hunting for her. The beams were getting closer, bouncing frantically as they ran. They were faster than her. She was losing ground. A sob of pure terror escaped her lips. She was running out of time, running out of forest, running out of hope. The single pinprick of light from Hemlock's house seemed impossibly far away. "There she is," a rough voice bellowed from behind. The flashlight beams converged, pinning her in their glare. She was exposed, a moth caught in a spotlight. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her system. She veered sharply to the right, plunging deeper into a thicket of rhododendron. The broad, leathery leaves slapped at her face and tangled in her hair, slowing her down, but providing a moment of cover from the light. She could hear them thrashing through the brush right behind her, cursing as the branches whipped at them. "Get her! Croft'll have our hides if she gets away." The words confirmed her deepest fear. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a direct order from the man in the tweed jacket. They were here to erase her, to erase the evidence, to scrub the final witness from the face of the earth. She was a loose end in a story he had been writing for 40 years. She burst out of the thicket and saw a small, shallow creek ahead. The water gurgled over smooth stones, the sound a sudden, peaceful intrusion into the violent chaos of the chase. Without hesitating, she plunged in. The water was shockingly, breathtakingly cold, a jolt of icy pain that shot up her legs. It soaked her thin pants and worn shoes instantly, chilling her to the bone. But she didn't care. The water would hide her tracks. It might confuse them for a precious few seconds. She scrambled up the opposite bank, her wet clothes heavy, her shoes squelching with every step. Her breath was coming in ragged, desperate sobs. She could no longer feel the pain in her ankle or the sting of the cuts on her arms. Her entire body was just a machine, fueled by a single, burning imperative: survive. She had to get to Leo. She had to deliver this box. The ground began to slope steeply upward. The woods thinned slightly here, and she could see the light from Hemlock's house more clearly now. It wasn't a pinprick anymore. It was a window, a warm, yellow rectangle of safety in the suffocating blackness. It was so close. The hope that surged through her gave her a final burst of energy. She clawed her way up the muddy incline, her fingers digging into the soft earth, pulling herself upward. She could hear the men splashing through the creek behind her. They hadn't been delayed for long. The flashlight beams were back, sweeping the hillside below her. She kept her head down, trying to use the cover of the few remaining trees to stay hidden. Her body screaming with exhaustion. Just a little further, just a few more yards. The thought became a mantra, a prayer she repeated with every burning breath and every pounding heartbeat. She reached the crest of the hill and saw it, a small, neat clearing, and in its center, a tiny, simple cabin, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. The window glowed with a welcoming, steady light. It was Hemlock's house. It was safety. She could see the door. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief tore from her throat. She stumbled out of the tree line and into the clearing, a desperate final sprint across the open ground. The light from the window spilled out onto a small, well-tended porch. She could hear Leo crying inside. He was safe. The knowledge was a physical wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She was almost there. The shouts of the men behind her were closer now, angrier. As they realized she was about to escape, "Don't let her reach the house," one of them screamed. She threw herself at the door, her shoulder slamming into the solid wood. It flew open, and she half ran, half fell inside, into the warmth and the light. The room smelled of wood smoke, coffee and old books. It was small, cluttered, but it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. Mr. Hemlock was there, a shotgun held loosely in his hands, his face grim. Leo ran to her, his small arms wrapping around her legs, his face buried in her wet, torn pants. "Mama! Mama!" he cried, his body shaking. Eleanor dropped the metal box onto the floor with a loud clang. She sank to her knees, her strength completely gone, and wrapped her arms around her son, burying her face in his hair. She breathed in his familiar scent, the only anchor in a world that had just been consumed by fire and violence. She had made it. They had made it. Hemlock was already moving, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and sliding a thick iron bolt into place with a satisfying, final thud. The sound was a declaration of defiance, a line drawn against the chaos outside. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through the edge of the curtains. "They're in the clearing," he said, his voice low and tense. "But they won't try the door. Not with a light on, not with a witness." He looked back at Elena, who was still on the floor, trembling and holding her son. His gaze fell on the rusted box lying on the floorboards, then on the deep, bleeding gash on her arm. "You did it, girl," he said, a note of awe in his gravelly voice. "You did what your father never could. You got the proof out." Outside, they could hear the men shouting in frustration, their flashlight beams cutting across the windows, but they were outside, and she was in. The immediate threat was held at bay, but Elena knew this was far from over. Croft's men were just outside. The burning shell of her father's cabin was a testament to how far he was willing to go. They were trapped in this small cabin, a tiny island of defiance in an ocean of Croft's power. The bolt on the door was a temporary shield, not a permanent solution. Hemlock walked over to an old rotary phone sitting on a small table. He picked up the receiver, his gnarled finger moving to the dial. "Croft might own the sheriff," he said, his voice hard as iron, "but he doesn't own everyone." He began to dial a long sequence of numbers, each click of the rotary dial a slow, deliberate beat in the tense silence of the room. Each click was a hammer blow against the empire Silas Croft had built, a signal being sent out from this tiny, besieged fortress in the heart of the mountains, calling for a justice that was 40 years overdue. The old rotary phone was a relic, but in Mr. Hemlock's hands, it was a weapon. Elena listened, her arm throbbing, as he recited the number from memory. The slow, deliberate clicks of the dial were the only sound in the cabin, each one a hammer blow against the silence of decades. Outside, she could hear the frustrated shouts of Croft's men, a bestial sound that made the fine hairs on her neck stand up. Hemlock's voice was low and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos. "David, it's Abel Hemlock. It's time." There was a crackle on the line, then a voice, sharp and clear from Atlanta. Elena heard words that were foreign and beautiful: racketeering, federal jurisdiction, mail fraud. They were words of power, a language that bypassed the corrupt local authorities entirely. The lawyer said an FBI team was being mobilized from the nearest field office. They would be there by dawn. The call ended. They were no longer just two people and a boy in a cabin. They were the beginning of an avalanche, and all they had to do now was wait for the mountain to fall. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, but now it was tinged with something else: justice. The long hours of the night stretched into an eternity. After one final, furious roar of their engine, the thug's truck finally sped away, leaving a silence that was somehow more menacing. Elena felt as if her nervous system was a live wire, every creak of the old cabin sending a fresh jolt of terror through her. Mr. Hemlock, a rock of calm in the storm, gently cleaned the deep gash on her arm with antiseptic that stung with a clean grounding pain, then wrapped it tightly. The smell of the disinfectant mingled with the aroma of the strong black coffee he brewed on his wood stove, a scent that was bitter and comforting all at once. Leo, his small body finally succumbing to the night's trauma, slept deeply in a worn armchair. Elena couldn't sleep. She sat at the table, the rusted metal box before her like a covenant. She felt the weight of every name in every letter, a silent army of witnesses gathered in the small, warm room. Her exhaustion was a deep, physical ache, a pain that settled into her very bones, but her mind refused to rest, replaying the chase, the fire, the cold promise in Croft's eyes, over and over. Dawn arrived not with warmth, but with a cold, grey light that seeped through the window, outlining the world in shades of silver and ash. The waiting was a new form of torture, a quiet, gnawing anxiety. Then a sound, a low, purposeful hum of engines, distinct from the brutal growl of the pickup truck. Elena's heart seized, but Hemlock placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "That's them," he murmured. Peeking through the curtain, she saw not one truck, but a convoy of dark sedans moving with a silent, coordinated grace. They didn't even slow down at the sight of the smoldering ruin of her father's cabin. They drove directly into Hemlock's clearing and parked in a neat, disciplined formation. Men in dark jackets with the bold yellow letters FBI on the back emerged. Their movements swift and certain. They were real. It was real. The sight of this quiet, overwhelming force arriving to answer their call was so surreal that Eleanor's legs felt weak. Relief, potent and dizzying, washed over her, and tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back began to fall, hot and silent, down her cheeks. A calm, methodical woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake sat opposite Eleanor at the small kitchen table. The metal box, the source of so much terror and hope, lay open between them, its fragile contents being handled with gloved reverence by another agent. The smell of coffee was a comforting anchor in the whirlwind of official activity. Eleanor told her story. Her voice was a ragged whisper at first, but it grew stronger with each word, each relived moment of fear. She spoke of the eviction notice, the rotting cabin, the loose stone. She described Silas Croft's face, the coldness in his eyes, the casual way he had threatened her child's life. She recounted the smell of gasoline, the roar of the fire, the splintering wood of the window, the frantic chase through the dark woods. The agent listened, her expression unwavering, taking notes without interrupting. Elena realized that for the first time in her life, her words had power. She wasn't a victim begging for help. She was a witness delivering a verdict. Each letter, each proof, was a nail being hammered into a coffin that had been waiting 40 years to be sealed. The FBI raid was a silent, swift invasion. From the aerial view of a news helicopter, Silas Croft's estate was an island of obscene wealth, its manicured lawns and Georgian mansion a monument to a lifetime of theft. The convoy of dark sedans that swept up the long, winding driveway was a jarring intrusion of consequence into this world of impunity. Agents fanned out, their movements a display of disciplined force that no local sheriff could stand against. Croft was escorted from his front door not in his usual armor of tailored tweed, but in a pathetic silk dressing gown, his face a mask of confusion and sputtering rage. The man who had moved lives and mountains with a phone call stood blinking in the morning sun, utterly powerless. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs closing around his thin, wrinkled wrists echoed in the quiet air, a sound of finality, a sound of accounts being settled. As he was led to a waiting car, he looked small and frail, a ghost haunted by the justice he had outrun for so long, finally caught. His empire of fear had crumbled in the space of a single morning. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. David, the young lawyer from the Atlanta Foundation, was a force of nature, his energy a stark contrast to the slow, patient evil he was dismantling. The box of letters, combined with her father's original, true survey maps found hidden at the very bottom, formed an irrefutable case. The FBI's investigation cascaded, uncovering decades of bribery and corruption that led to the indictment of a county judge and 2 former sheriffs. David filed a massive class-action lawsuit on behalf of the descendants of the families from the letters, with Eleanor and Abel Hemlock as the lead plaintiffs. The story exploded in the news, a modern fable of David and Goliath, of a forgotten secret in a rusty box bringing down a king. Elena, once so invisible she felt like a ghost, was now the face of this fight. She felt her father's presence beside her, not as a specter of guilt, but as a partner, his long-suppressed courage finally finding its voice through her. The weight on her shoulders was immense, but it was the profound weight of purpose, not despair. The legal victory was absolute. The courts nullified the fraudulent deeds from the 1970s, a seismic legal event that redrew the map of the county. Croft's assets were frozen, and a massive settlement fund was established to compensate the families for their stolen land and 40 years of lost prosperity. For her central role in bringing the truth to light, the court awarded Elena a special dispensation. She was granted the full legal title, not just to the small, charred plot her father had left her, but to a vast adjoining tract of 500 acres of prime mountain land, encompassing the original Hemlock homestead and 2 others. The land, bordering a national park, was breathtakingly valuable. A check arrived by courier, and when Elena saw the numbers, her breath caught in her throat. It was a sum that was simply incomprehensible, an amount that rendered her entire past life of desperate poverty a distant, painful dream. She thought of the 47 talents she had counted on that grimy table. The contrast was so violent, so absolute, that she started to laugh, a sound that was half sob, half pure, unadulterated freedom. With the storm of legal battles finally over, Elena returned with Leo to the site of the cabin. A gentle rain had washed away much of the ash, leaving the blackened timbers and the great stones of the fireplace standing like ancient ruins. The air smelled clean, of wet earth and new beginnings. Standing there amidst the wreckage, she felt a profound sense of peace. She told Leo the full story of his grandfather, not of a man who had rejected them, but of a man who had sacrificed his own life and happiness to protect them from a monster. This place was not a grave but a crucible, where her father's love had been tested and proven. She looked out at the rolling mountains, the endless green canopy that was now, impossibly, hers. She finally understood. Her father had given her more than land or money. He had given her back her own history. A deep, cleansing wave of forgiveness washed through her, erasing the last scars of resentment. She had hated a man who was a hero, and now, in understanding his love, she was finally able to heal. 1 year later, the sound is not the frantic whir of a singer machine, but the laughter of a child and the gentle whisper of wind through tall pine trees. A new house stands where the ruin once was, crafted from warm wood and local stone, its large windows drinking in the mountain sunlight. Inside, the air smells of baking bread and fresh coffee. Elena sits in a sun-drenched studio, not hunched over cheap fabric in a dim room, but sketching designs in a book, her face relaxed and full of a quiet, confident joy. She is building her own clothing line, a business born of creativity, not desperation. She looks out the window at Leo, chasing a butterfly in a meadow of wildflowers, and the ache of love she feels is pure, untainted by fear or guilt. The chronic pain in her shoulders is gone. The constant, gnawing hunger is a distant memory, a story from another life. She has found more than security. She has found a home in her own skin, a sense of belonging to the world that she had never known. She is safe. She is whole. She is free. The dinner table is heavy with food, a roast chicken, steaming vegetables from their own garden, a freshly baked pie. The warm light from the house spills out into the evening, a beacon of welcome. Mr. Hemlock is there, his eyes twinkling as he tells Leo a story about a mischievous bear. Elena watches them, her heart so full it feels tangible, a warm, solid presence in her chest. This scene of abundance, of laughter, of family, is the reality her father had died hoping for. It's the answered prayer from all those desperate letters. She raises her glass, the liquid catching the light, in a silent toast to the man who had loved her from a distance, the man whose sacrifice had finally bloomed into this beautiful, peaceful life. Elena's journey proves that the deepest secrets often hide the greatest truths, and that one person's courage can echo through generations. What stories of quiet heroism and hidden sacrifices lie buried in your own family's past? If you were inspired by Elena's fight for justice, subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit against all odds.